had to use the cars they had and hold them together any way they could with tape, chicken wire, any way they could keep the cars running, scrounge up for parts, go to a junkyard and find parts. Anything they had to do to keep their cars going, take good care of their cars. A lot of new factories were built. Old factories were converted to war factories. Oh yes, and one of the factories that was built right away at the start of the war was Lockheed, nearby here, where I happened to spend 27 years of my working career. Lockheed they started digging out the tunnels in 1942. And if you ever go inside Lockheed, you'll notice the block work was obviously done by amateurs, and I told my children, you can see these men had never laid a block in their life, but the government said, hey, you got a job laying block, and they laid block as best they could. Then I'll show them a section of block, and I thought, this was a professionally done job. This was professionally done. But the other, they just simply put the block down on the concrete and move on to the next block, and the blocks were, some of them tilted this way. But it's lasted for about 60 to 70 years now. Lockheed was one of the plants that was built as a war plant. It closed for a while after the war, then reopened. Threatened to close several more times, but reopened. Last count I heard, they're going to be hiring about 700 more workers to build some airplanes for foreign governments, including South Korea. Germany, they started off enthused for the war. I mean, in 1914 they were enthused, but in 1939 they were really quiet. A lot of Germans somehow knew that there was a big disaster coming. Hitler tried to keep the morale of the people at home up, and he made another one of his big blunders. And instead of telling his people, you must deprive yourself so the troops can have food and weapons, he tried to keep the people happy at the expense of the troops. Again, folk, Hitler made more blunders than a man should make. I mean, he blundered when he had his generals go into Russia in the first place. He blundered when he told them to go to Stalingrad instead of the oil fields. He blundered at Dunkirk when the generals had the war won and he called them back. He blundered at D-Day when he decided to sleep in and didn't order the Panzers on time, didn't order the Panzer fight on time. And then during the entire war, he tried to give he told his people, don't deprive yourselves, enjoy life, enjoy living, we're going to win without deprivation. Eventually, Albert Speer was made minister, and he did a lot to make the war machine more efficient. I want to say this about Albert Speer. He got out of prison in 1966 after serving 20 years. And he said that the problem with Nazi Germany, he said, they entertained delusions. And they said, every one of us entertains a delusion, but if we entertain delusion normally, somebody's there to laugh at us. We said in Nazi Germany, we'd sit around Hitler's table, we'd all entertain our delusions, and nobody would laugh at us. That's something I read some 50 years ago that I thought has been really interesting. Japan, the book talks about how that they were preparing for war long before it happened, something that we hadn't done. Emphasized obligation, honor, defend the emperor, defend the company, sacrifice one's life. Oh yes, Japan was famous for its kamikazes at the end of the war. Now, the kamikaze was where they load an airplane with ammunition and send this airplane off, and a pilot knew he was going to ram his airplane into an American ship and blow the ship up. It's called a suicide mission, or kamikaze. Now, when the American ship, Navy personnel first saw the kamikaze, went, what is going on? This airplane would just keep coming at them, and they'd fire in desperation. The airplane would keep coming at them. In a lot of cases, though, they'd hit the plane and it would blow up without coming at them, and a lot of the planes fell harmlessly into the sea. We later learned that those planes were hard to steer, but nobody survived to tell the Japanese that. The planes were difficult. Also, the pilots who flew them were highly drugged and just after a while they didn't care. Oh yeah, I'm going to hit it. Go, I'll hit it, and the next thing, they landed harmlessly in the water. So the kamikaze was not all that effective, but some of them really did hit an American ship and did quite a bit of damage. Suicide missions. Women's rights were sacrificed. The women were told go home and bear children, bear more children, because this is how we're going to win the war. Ironically, Japanese women are hardly bearing any children today, or very few. Instead of using Japanese women to fill in labor shortages, the Japanese brought in Koreans and Chinese to work their factories. Basically, they worked them as slave laborers. Again, another one of the Japanese atrocities. The book talks more about the bombing of cities. How that the war was the most destructive in all of history, and left a whole lot of rubble that took many, many years to clean up. Now, unfortunately, I mean, your book says, and I've been reading this too, that the Allied bombing raids in Germany were not all that effective. I mean, why not? Well, the bombing, for one thing, the bombing was not at all accurate. And a lot of the bombs missed. I mean, particularly, it was really hard for a pilot to hit the runway. I mean, if he was to sign out, I want you to go destroy this runway, well, he might hit something other than the runway, and oftentimes hit nothing if it was important, hit a forest nearby. But also, the book says that the bombings only made the Germans more determined than ever to get out and fight, more determined to win, and did not really destroy the morale, or did not increase the production, decrease the production. Now, a lot of German factories were bombed. The Germans would just simply, when the bombing alarm sounded, go into shelters, stay in the shelters with the all clear sign. The all clear sign, come back out and go back to work as best they could between the rubble. And then they'd work until the next bombing raid siren sounded. Then they'd go hide, and then when that was over, they'd go beat up, go back to work. Again, having worked in a factory for many years myself, I wonder what it would be like. We had bomb shelters at Lockheed. Just, you know, go duck down a bomb shelter for a while. Now, something else. The Germans made a big mistake, and the Japanese did too. They bunched all their factories together in a few locations, which made them easy targets. Now, I'll say this, Lockheed. Lockheed itself is scattered, but our factories are scattered all over the place. So Lockheed is the one located in Marietta. There's another one located in Meridian. There's another one located at Fort Worth. Another one located in some places in Florida. They're scattered all over the place. Our war factory, and also Lockheed, initially, the big building had no windows. That meant from an airplane flying overhead, he could supposedly not see it from the outside. Now today, if you pass by Lockheed, they shine lights on it to keep airplanes from hitting the building. But if they turn the lights out, it'd be difficult to tell where the place is. But it had no windows, and it was designed to where it'd be difficult to see. Again, painted in such a way that it's difficult to find. But our factories were scattered, either thither and yon. Germany's and Japan's factories were bunched together, which made them easier to hit. Your book does go into the argument about the bomb, how that the people on the one side say it was cruel, people on the other side say, look how many lives it saved. It saved thousands of lives on both sides. All right. One thing that World War II brought about was decolonization. The nations of the world that had colonies were told you must give them up. Now, one exception, the United States still has Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico doesn't want to become independent. I mean, after all, Puerto Rico gets all these millions of dollars from the United States, and it's a tourist place also. So the Puerto Rico we didn't give up. We also kept Wake Island and Samoa, but we did give up the Philippines. As for the other nations of the world, eventually Great Britain was to give up Jamaica, give up India, and give Canada and Australia practically all the independence they could ask for. Same thing with New Zealand. And France was to give up Vietnam, but not without a fight. Belgium was eventually given the Congo. Basically, colonization was looked on as being frowned on. A process called decolonization. Turn your colonies loose. Your book said Great Britain no longer had the energy or the wealth to maintain the empire, so they gave up India. India had more people in it than Britain itself. Now, we come to the 3 conferences, which I want to elaborate on, but we don't have time today. Well, I am going to take a little bit of time, though. I always said if I ever become a teacher, I want to make sure I don't forget to mention these conferences. Here's why. It was at these conferences the groundwork was laid for the Cold War that followed. These conferences were the first one at Tehran, Iran, Yalta, and Potsdam. The conferences featured the heads of state of the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain. They would meet. Now, in the first 2 conferences, you have the President of the United States was Roosevelt. So Roosevelt went to Tehran and Yalta. By the Potsdam Conference, Roosevelt was dead and Truman went there. And same way with Great Britain. The first 2 conferences were attended by Churchill. The British replaced Churchill with another prime minister. I think his name was Attlee. But anyway, the Potsdam Conference featured different leaders for the U.S. and Great Britain. But in the case of the Soviet Union, it was Stalin in all 3 conferences. Now, here's a point I want to make, and then I'll close. There are times in your life, there might be a time when you might be forced to be friends with a man like Joseph Stalin. When you're friends with a man like Joseph Stalin, how come we were friends with him? Well, he was attacked by Hitler, so Hitler was our enemy. The enemy of our enemy is our friend, so we were forced into a friendship with him. All right, what kind of friend was he? He criticized severely. Now, hey, we were fighting his war in Japan. He didn't have to fight in Japan, but he said, you're not doing enough. You ought to open up a front. Well, we're trying, Mr. Stalin, to open up a front. You're not doing it. He didn't trust us. He was always critical of us. And then when the war was over, he turned on us and took over a third of Eastern Europe. That's the kind of friend he was. Have I ever had friends like that? Yes, 3 times in my life I've had to associate with people, maybe not as evil as Stalin, people whom I otherwise would not have. Time number 1, when I was a kid growing up in a bad neighborhood because we grew up in poverty. Time number 2 was when I was teaching in public schools, and some of the kids were the type of kids that if you just, the public schools in America cannot be fixed. If that offends you, I'm sorry. I've had students take offense at some of the things I say about American public schools. They're beyond repair. Now for the 3rd time. When I was still an unmarried man in my 30s and having to date women who were in their late 20s and early 30s, most of whom never married. And if you ever meet one of them, they could tell you, some of them could tell you all kinds of bad things about me, some of which might actually contain a little bit of truth. Their own lives were hopeless and futile. And if you associate with someone who is a drunk, or who is unsuccessful in everything they do, who drifts from job to job, if you associate with them, guess what? They are going to look down on you as being worse. All right, you get 2 unequal people together. The one who's most unequal will look down on the one who's higher than he is. Do any of you think you know what I'm talking about? It's a psychological phenomenon known as projection. And if you are an intelligent person and you're trying to reason with a person whose intellect is down here and yours is up here, forget it. They will look on your decisions on everything as being immoral, stupid, or both. You can't reason with them, you can't talk to them. But sometimes you're forced, maybe at the workplace, you might be forced under a boss who is the kind of man I'm talking about. A man you can't please, always at fault, always wrong. This is basically describes our relationship with Stalin. And that's the ground. Now, when we come back on Monday, I'll go into a little more detail. But essentially, the conferences laid the groundwork for the Soviet takeover of Europe. I'm not saying Roosevelt was at fault. As a young man, I believe that. But now I realize, hey, Roosevelt had no choice. He was forced into it, and Stalin had every right to be in the conference because the Soviet Union contributed more fatalities, contributed more to the war effort than anybody else. So I've gone a little bit over my minutes. I'll see you.